Good afternoon, everyone. This is Angela with Women's Personal Finance. Regina's here as well. And today we are welcoming back Stefanie O'Connell to talk to us today. She came initially a couple of years ago to talk about her book before really getting very far into the writing. And today we are having her back to talk in preparation of it being published at the beginning of next year or mid next year. So, Stefanie, welcome. And if you want to introduce yourself a little bit and tell us about the ambition penalty.
Hi, everyone. I'm Stefanie O'Connell. I'm so psyched to be back here. If you have caught anything that I've spoken about before, it was probably about this book because it has been a huge undertaking for like the last half decade or more of my career. And the book is called The Ambition Penalty, as Angela said. And the subtitle is How Corporate Culture Tells Women to Step Up and Then Pushes Them Down. And it's really an exploration of the paradox that sits at the heart of so much of the so called empowerment advice that women have been given. So basically, everything women have been told to do to get ahead at work. Things like, well, just be more confident, well, just ask for more, just power pose, whatever it is, really hasn't done anything to move the needle on the gender pay gap collectively. And part of the reason for that is this ambition penalty, where those actions trigger backlash in the workplace because they violate expectations, patriarchal expectations of how women should, quote unquote, behave, which is the expectation that women will be deferential, that they will be support people and not the leaders, that their labor is to support the labor of other people who are going to be overwhelmingly men, white men, cis men, able bodied men, who are going to be the ones who see the rewards in their finances, in their attainment of power, in their attainment of status. And should women or other marginalized identities try to lay claim to any of those rewards for themselves or do those actions that we tell them to do to access it, we see in the research that they are far more likely than their privileged male counterparts to experience backlash for doing so. And this has really effectively led us to a stalled state when it comes to issues of equity. And in fact, as we've seen in recent years, a regression in terms of rights, in terms of outcomes, and in terms of cultural attitudes. And so when I started writing this book, I was really just interested in the workplace dynamics. But as I started to research and write, the way that the workplace dynamics and the home dynamics intersected became very interesting to me. And then the way those were all together encapsulated by the larger cultural and political sphere became like impossible to disentangle. And so what started out as what I thought was like this relatively straightforward workplace analysis and like what we get wrong about how women get ahead or should get ahead or can get ahead is actually this huge political, cultural, personal, community based conversation, and not just about how we're dressing or the punctuation we use in our emails, right? It's this much, much broader dynamic.
And I really appreciate that you specifically like dig into the research because I feel like so much of these conversations are really on vibes and
Mm.
less on like actual data. It's kind of the, well, you just need to ask for more money. You just need to negotiate more because like that's the conversation that happens it again and again. And I think it's really important. We are in a room of money nerds here, and, you know, we understand how much we need to rely on data when it comes to investing in our finances and preparing for retirement. And yet, when it comes to like workplace conversations, we don't generally have the same amount of like data and information to go off for the most part. So I think it's really important that you use that data and also that you've found that data because I don't think that most of the time that gets talked about.
Yeah, I was actually really surprised when I started doing the research for my book. It started out as a lot of interviews that I was doing with people anecdotally. But then I thought, is this an exception? Is this like a weird, this never happens thing? And I just so happen to keep running into these people. And I found out that actually there's a ton of research on these dynamics, and they have received shockingly little attention. And in part, it's because of the way the mythology of meritocracy and basically all these systems of power work to uphold themselves. Even when I share data that says, oh, not only have women been just as likely to negotiate their salaries as their male counterparts for decades in the United States, but they're more likely to be penalized for asking, then you'll just get the same predictable talking points in the comments about why that's not a reliable study, or why, well, that doesn't account for women's negotiation style, or it doesn't account for these hours that they're working, or it doesn't account for their industry. And the thing is, it's a never ending source of content for me because there's data on all this stuff. And every single one of those talking points that's just so committed to upholding the mythology that inequality is simply a matter of behaviors and choices and preferences, that's a manifestation of these things that we can all freely choose differently rather than the way that the systems penalize or reward us differently depending on who we are and our identity and then the context in which we're asking. That it just allow those myths allow for those systems that reward and penalize different people in different ways to sustain themselves and to continue perpetuating this inequality because we're more committed to upholding the myth that everything is fair than we are to making things fair. And that is really, really destructive. And one of the most fascinating pieces of research, it's not just one paper, there's actually a lot of research that was published while I was writing this book, which was so validating. It shows that not only are these myths, but they also undermine our propensity to engage in collective action and support policies that would actually confront this inequality. So, in that example of the salary negotiation study, I think it's Jessica Cray, it's Cray, Kennedy, and Lee, I think are the last names of the authors. Really great paper. They're not just showing these patterns of women being just as likely to ask for more and less likely to get what they ask for. They also show that the belief that women are just less likely to ask for more money is associated with less willingness to support policies like pay transparency and vote for those kinds of policies and support those kinds of politicians, even as those are the exact kinds of real systemic changes that have been proven to reduce these not just gender inequities, but racial inequities and all forms of pay inequality. So that's just one data point, but there's also many others that show the more we're indoctrinated into this belief of like very individualistic ideals of meritocracy where your rewards are reflective of your effort or your hustle or whatever it is you want to call it, the more we get into this loop of like, oh, the system makes sense. Like, if I just work harder, I can achieve the same or equal outcomes, even if that is not borne out in the data time and time again. And because the more I buy into that belief, the less likely I become, again, statistically, to support collective action, unions, policies like universal healthcare or childcare or family leave, and all of these other things that would actually equalize outcomes. What I wind up getting into is just like a hamster wheel of self optimization where I'm always internalizing myself as the problem. And then I'm run ragged. And then burnt out and thinking, oh, it just must be me. Like, I don't really have uh, my ambition anymore, not because I've been held to a different standard, not because I'm not able to access the same rewards, not because all these other things. No, it's just because it must be something wrong with me, and then that gets extrapolated out into the collective of like this myth that just women have less professional ambition, less public ambition, less desire to quote unquote get ahead relative to their male peers, and that's just nonsense.
Well, and I can imagine too, if you believe that women don't ask for money or and negotiate, that when someone does show up asking for more money and asking to like negotiate, that that's super off-putting because you don't expect it even if you should. Is that
Correct. It's
yeah.
like a, well, who do you think you are? You think you're the exception, right? It's really a self-defeating cycle. This is actually interesting because it brings me to another like theme that comes up a lot in the discourse around women in positions of management or in leadership, where we get this stereotype, and quite frankly, like often reflected in the behaviors of the mean girl, like, oh, this, the worst boss I ever had was a woman. And like that could be true anecdotally, but it is not representative of the data in any way. The reality is that the more women are represented in positions of workplace management, especially once you get to a kind of critical level of representation, the more likely those who are lower further down the career ladder are going to have better opportunities for advancement regardless of identity. The more pay gaps close, the more policy that is exclusionary, like parental leave policies that like aren't equitably applied, becomes challenged, and the more the status quo of like a very narrow model of male dominance and leadership is challenged. But the reason that this stereotype persists is not just because there are obviously examples, many, many examples of women and men behaving badly in management positions, um, but the idea that there's somehow more women behaving this way rather than men is a factor of many things. One is just the way in which women who are using who are getting ahead by supporting policies that undermine other women, is it's an incredibly effective way to get ahead. However, again, this is not representative. This is very real. We have many examples of it in history and right now in our American politics, right? It becomes a very useful way of saying, look, we can't be sexist. Like, we support women, we're supporting this woman, even as though that woman is really just using her platform. She's her identity is being used as cover for a platform that actually hurts women. But again, this is like not something that women do exclusively, but because these are such high profile examples and women are so underrepresented in leadership and management in general, it winds up becoming a very effective way to cast women with power and women with leadership like as an idea, as something bad and as something terrible. And what happens is we see this on a much more micro level in a lot of workplaces, because the very things that women need to do to adapt to the workplace culture, to be part of the old boys club, to fit in, the things that they are demanded to be accepted, to have their positions um, secured, is is to conform to those same patriarchal standards and those same patriarchal behaviors as their male counterparts. They're emulating the workplace environment. And that's not a good thing. But the way you challenge that is not by not having women in leadership, it's by having enough women in leadership that they have enough buy in to change the culture. And it's very, very hard to get that buy in because we're all like indoctrinated into this myth that all women with power are mean girls, when in fact like the problem is this like patriarchal standard, while that like labels women as like these mean girl queen bees, while men who do the same things are the alphas. They're worthy of respect, they're worthy of their power, and they're doing the same toxic stuff. So this is not me advocating or providing cover for that kind of behavior. I don't think it is. It's a way of saying like the way this is happening is these patriarchal expectations and the way they reward us and punish us so effectively not only keep systems of hierarchy, forced gender hierarchy, racial hierarchy, or any other hierarchy in place, but they also create this mythology around why it makes sense, quote unquote. And that one of those myths is just like, yeah, women aren't asking to get ahead or they're not confident enough. Another is like, well, all women who do get ahead or all women who do have power are really the biggest reason other women don't have power, even though that's not reflected in the data either. And so I think my book is just like full of the studies and the data that interrogate these assumptions and this myth making, what those assumptions enable and how they get passed down, and like what are the numbers we can use like in our day-to-day life as we're talking about these things to challenge those ideals.
Yeah, well, and it's kind of like we talk a lot in the money space that there are certain women in personal finance that use the exact same language, the exact same playbook, but are seen as, feminist and empowerment people. But really, the only thing that's really different is the fact that they're not a man.
Yeah. And then we also have like I mean, this gets to the whole girl boss culture more broadly, like in the finance space, in the workplace space, this kind of culture of like making it pink, putting lipstick on it, putting high heels on it. It's just it really became a way of signaling like women can be here too. And I think for the last 10 years we've been reckoning with why that's not a great thing always, right? Like the point isn't for women to be here too. The point is for women to be here, and then for enough women to be here that we can collectively change the culture, not on behalf of me as a woman, but on behalf of all women and all people. Because we also see in the data that what is good for women collectively is also good for most people, right? For the culture, for the children, for people across identity. Anytime you're really challenging the status quo of, what power has to look like and what it has to act like, that's what I think really, really powerful in ways that, like, I don't think that achieving a certain title as someone who's underrepresented is challenging a status quo. It's using that title to then challenge the systems of power that exclude and disempower people, and really create these systems that rely on such inequality to begin with.
So how is it that you specifically decided that this was going to be your thing? Like money, ambition, gender, like how did you decide? Because, your background is like in journalism and
Yeah.
personal finance, and like how did you decide that this was going to be your focus?
When I started writing about personal finance, I was so bought into so many of this myth of meritocracy, this bootstrapping, this hyper individualism, where like the idea of all it takes to get ahead is like your own grit, your own determination, and whatever you want to achieve for yourself, like that's what it is. And if I could just arm myself and arm others with the right information, then right, we can do anything we want. And it's not that I'm a pessimistic person now, but I want to be honest. I want people to be able to do what they want. But I think there is a line between talking about those things in a way that's real and a way that's talking about things in a way that is misinformed. And ultimately, what we're seeing now backfires, and it regresses and it takes away our rights and our opportunities rather than expanding them. And I came to that consciousness through writing. Like, I think a lot of it started with my early assignments were so prescriptive, like 5 ways to improve your credit score. And that stuff is just like very interesting information when you don't know it, and it's useful and it's helpful. And I think we all need to know it. But I didn't really go past that to think like, well, what is like the system of credit and who does it serve and why was it created that way and why is it still this way and who is that helping and who is that hurting, until I started interacting with more people, and at first in the personal finance space, but even more so, I would say, like, expanding outside of the space into cultural spaces, into history, feminism, like politics. I think I that consciousness was certainly a response to the political and cultural environment of the last 15 years, for sure. But I think it's also just something, like, I would hope everyone experiences as they go through the process of their own life and aging. Like, I'm 39 now. I was in my 20s when I started writing about money. Like, there's a lot of learning and evolution that I would hope we would all do. But what I see happen is, like, people experience things and they'll often have some cognitive dissonance when what they believe about the world and their experience of it doesn't quite line up. They'll create these myths and they'll tell themselves these stories because those are the stories that have been handed down to us about, well, this make, I deserve these unequal outcomes, or I deserve this unfair treatment because it must be something about the way I worded my email or the way I dressed or the way, because, like, this is the lifetime of messaging we've been fed. And I feel very lucky that I got those experiences as a writer, as someone who was doing a lot of reporting, as someone who did a lot of interviews and got paid to do research, basically, to really shatter that myth for myself, and then, like, hopefully help other people shatter that myth because it's really not serving any of us.
Yeah. So, like within those like myth shattering stuff, like we talked some about, how women do ask for more just as
Mm.
much as men, but they get turned down a lot more than men. You've shared stories in your news or in your Substack about women that actually get like job offers rescinded for
Oh my
asking
gosh,
for more.
yes.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
think you were the first. I think it was from you that I had ever heard that the first time because, the normal is, well, what's the worst that can happen? They can
Mm.
say no. But like we expect they can say no is just like, okay, the offer is what it is, not they're going to say no and take the offer away altogether. Um, is that the most surprising or counterintuitive
Mm.
thing you found? Or like what's like the most surprising or like unexpected bit in the research that you found around ambition?
I guess I would say I was surprised at to the extent of which public inequality, professional inequality, economic inequality is underpinned by private inequality. How much what happens in the home and in the family, it, and or rather how much uh, professional inequality and public inequality depends on inequality in the home. Like, the data on the difference in wages between married men and single men is wild. Like, even if you control for the selection effect, because those who are more educated, those who have higher incomes are already more likely to marry. But even if you control for that, there's a huge wage premium for men who are married to women. And even in the
Specifically men who are married to women.
correct
Okay.
heterosexual marriage specifically. And it's pretty wild because you'll watch single men's incomes on these charts track very closely with other people's incomes, like with women's incomes, and even segmented out further across identity. And so it's really interesting to consider how much what we talk about at work isn't just an issue of workplace culture, but how much it depends on culture of the care economy and household labor. So you can't have a 24/7 hustle culture attitude or approach to work with, like, these very strict in-office mandates with really long hours and everything else, and have a life that requires any responsibility to anyone else without having someone else that you are either paying to do all of that other labor outside of your workplace, or you are not paying to do all that other labor outside of your workplace. And I think the extent to which that workplace culture sustains itself through household inequality was not something I realized, and the amount of bias that it reinforces. So there's some really, really fascinating data. I reposted one of my reels on this recently about how when men are married to women who are full time at home, who are doing all of this care work for them and who do all this household labor, they become more likely to discriminate against women in the workplace. They're less likely to give those women opportunities for promotions, opportunities for pay. And anecdotally, I was reading in these papers how, like, there's this one woman who was working at an investment firm and she had a baby and she asked her manager, she was the only woman on her team, and she asked her manager, who was also a man, for the ability to work from home sometimes. And he just denied her. And he said, I don't understand why this is necessary. No one else needs this. And that's because no one else needs it, because they all had that. They all had that added support in the home. And so I think that we really underestimate the extent to which the worst things about workplace culture that we're trying to change really, really are underpinned by this chronic division, unequal division of labor that's happening, not just like in heterosexual relationships, but also beyond it. Like we see it with daughters versus sons and the elder care that they provide. And this is all just like driven by societal expectations where women are penalized if they do not perform this labor. They're more judged, they're more harshly criticized. And men are often very, very much supported when they do this labor. And that's not to say that there isn't flexibility stigma, that this stigma for caretaking for men in the workplace absolutely does exist. But I think when we talk about it, we often talk about it like, well, that's too high a cost for men to be expected to pay. So women should have to shoulder the full cost instead. and, and really, that just winds up reinforcing the status quo of these systems that like literally don't accommodate people who have to integrate these responsibilities of life outside of their work in a way that is really problematic.
So then beyond that, were you able to find data that digs into like the differing ambition penalty between like industry, race, class, location? Like, was there
Yes,
anything surprising there?
I do have a great study on this. I haven't made a reel about this, and this is hard because it's like I've been deciding to struggling to decide how much to tease of the research I came across in my book before it comes out, because I still got quite a
Well,
ways to
we can
go.
always cut this part out if you don't want it
No, no, no.
published.
It's such a great, is one of my favorite studies. So this is a study that looked at negotiation outcomes for men and women in the I think it's the Arab Gulf or one of the Arab Gulf countries. But it was they studied what happened when men and women in these countries asked for more with a local employer or with a global employer. And what they found was that when negotiating with local employers, you saw the same kinds of patterns that you see here all the time that we've been talking about here in the United States, where when women ask for more money, they're violating those expectations about how women should behave. And so they're more likely to face backlash, less likely to get what they ask for. And in the local context, the men were more likely to get what they asked for, more likely to be perceived favorably for doing so. However, when those men negotiated with employers in at a global company, like probably like I think it's Northern American based or a European based company, they face similar penalties that the women did in both contexts. So they were also more likely to be penalized for asking for more, to be perceived negatively. And so I think this is really, really important for a couple of reasons. First is that it shows that there is nothing inevitable about any of this. It shows that it's not something that women are uniquely doing wrong. And it shows how much context matters. And so what we're talking about here are social expectations and the influence of norms that say this is what power and leadership look like, and this is what who and we value these behaviors coming from, and this is who we don't want to see these behaviors from. In a local context where power is held by those men who were asking for more money, like, yeah, they were rewarded when they did so. But in a global context, that power is overwhelmingly not just male, but it's also white. It's also probably Northern American or European. And so like this totally arbitrary like status hierarchy is then being used to reinforce the outcomes of inequality, because it's saying, no, 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 power and privilege in this context, at this organization, it's not just about being a man, it's about being this kind of like right vision of manhood, which in this context was a white vision of manhood, which it often is across contexts. So it's just an example that I think is really, really powerful about like how this has nothing to do with what we are not worthy of or not capable of, and how random this all is. Like it's just about status and like the way status is arbitrarily assigned within society. And the good news is about that is like that is so easy to change. There is nothing fixed about this. And one of the other things I talk about is how these hierarchies are maintained. There, because when I talk about things as being systemic, or I talk about things as being like through enforced through these social norms or cultural like arbitrary hierarchies that say this is who should have power and this is who shouldn't, this is who should be in charge and this is who should be deferential. Like the truth is there those to maintain the illusion that that is like how things should be, you have to constantly change the rules, because what is happening is not natural by any stretch of the imagination. It is completely forced. I think a really good example of that is what's happening now in higher education. So now that women cannot be excluded from higher education, now that people of color cannot be excluded from higher education, now that we are better represented in terms of those who have higher ed degrees and are going into the workforce to use that, only now that we're doing that like is are people like in mass saying, oh well, college is a waste of money and it's not really important or whatever. Now I'm not here to argue about the value of college. That's a completely fair thing to talk about, but it's only when women are better represented in college and among degree holders that we even talk about like, oh well, this is what's important for being in a position of power. We change the metrics of what matters to be successful to align with what what we want the people in power to look like, not what the metrics of success are. Like we saw this again in standardized education here in the Northeast. There's a really cool book. I think it's called Race to the Top by Natasha Warku, I think her name is. And she talks about how in the Asian American community, all of the test scores were really outpacing that of the children, the white children in the school system, in the public school system. And so all of these parents then started saying, well, we shouldn't weight test scores so much. And I'm like, okay, that's like a real conversation we can have about standardized testing and the value of standardized testing. But it's only when, it's like the white privilege is under a quote unquote threat, like this metric that we've been using to exclude other people from accessing those rewards. When those people start gaining and outperforming, that we start to suddenly change what metrics matter.
So, and then a question in the chat also is any keys on ways we've seen these norms challenged effectively,
Mm-hmm.
aside from simply having more women in leadership?
Yes. The the hardest part of my book writing was solutions, because I didn't want to guess as you can probably tell from our conversation, everyone who's listening, I know Angela knows I'm like obsessed with data. So anything I talk about, I really want to make sure that it's really backed by a lot of evidence. And I think a lot of times, like, we have an idea of like what we think might work because it sounds right, but it's not actually effective and really changing outcomes. And when I talk about changing outcomes, I really want to be clear that I'm not talking about an individual level. I am talking about collective outcomes, like women's outcomes as a whole. And of course, that's like a huge, huge group of people with so much diversity within it. And so like there's so many different segmentations of those outcomes we could still like to dig into. But I want to say like when I talk about these things, oftentimes people will say like, well, this happened for me and this worked for me. And it's really just not a useful metric, just because first of all it's not representative in any way, unless you're talking about an experience that is representative of what's happening, but also because like it's a way of kind of negating what is actually happening to people collectively, and that's what we need to focus on, because ultimately like even if something does work for you and like it happens and that's wonderful, like you're getting ahead in the way you want, I want that for people, it doesn't say that the system isn't still a problem. And in fact, what I document in the book is like sometimes someone does get ahead and they do get that breakthrough, but if the culture around them hasn't changed, then they're still stuck in a system that's pushing back against them as they've like, let's say they got their promotion, but because the system and the culture around them hasn't changed, they're still subject to more harassment. They're still being discounted for future opportunities. They're still less likely to have their pay match their performance, in the process. And so I really do think it's really important that we contextualize outcomes collectively. So, in terms of what shifts outcomes collectively, the effective accountability mechanisms is really, really promising. And honestly, that says something as simple as just being transparent. When people have to report on their pay gaps, when they have to report across gender identity, across racial identity, sexual orientation, or whatever metric you want to parse for, gaps start to close, and that's without even like any other without any like system say, okay, well, we have this gap, so what are we going to do about it? Like even just the act of transparency itself can be a huge catalyst for change because it creates accountability. And people don't like to look like they're discriminating, but if they can get away with doing it on the slide, they'll continue to do it. But anything that adds a lot clarity and transparency, both to outcomes and to processes, can prove incredibly effective. So another example in terms of processes, great study about how when people were making hiring decisions, they would change the criteria as of what counts as qualified for to do the job well that they were hiring for, depending on the gender identity of the person that they were considering to hire. So, for example, when men were being evaluated, the evaluators would say, oh, like this guy's the guy for the job because like he has more street smarts and experience. But when women were being evaluated in like basically same format, it would be like if she had greater street smarts, then the evaluators would say, well, actually, like we need to go with the guy because he also has more education. But if the woman had more education, then they'd be like, actually, no, that doesn't matter. We just need to go with the street smarts. But instead, if you set those criteria in the process before looking at resumes to begin with, if you say, okay, before we even begin this process, what matters for doing this job well is X, Y, and Z, then it can standardize those criteria better. It creates more transparency around what matters for the role, and it holds everyone who's making those decisions more accountable. Now, that's not a foolproof system. And I would say, with everything that I found that effectively closes these gaps, none of these are foolproof systems, but they have to work hand in hand with like all the other kinds of solutions, quote unquote, solutions that I talk about. So, I talked about pay transparency, women in management, transparency, accountability. Like one of the best examples in the book was a case study where the company was not only using these transparency measures, and not only were they like reevaluating their criteria and trying to be more transparent about them, but they were constantly revisiting why outcomes were shaping up to be as unequal as they were. And so as they implemented these measures, and like let's say things got more unequal, instead of saying, well, that must just be because women are like this, men are like this, or like these people make these choices and these people make these choices, they didn't say that. They said, "Oh, something isn't working right." If you start from from the reality of the data that show us that we're all more alike, we're all more similarly minded than we are different as collective groups of people. Individually, of course, tons of variation, but as groups of people, we're all far more similar than we are different. If you start from that assumption, then when you see a huge divergence in what's happening in terms of outcomes or an inequity, it becomes something of a responsibility to say, oh, what are we doing wrong in our system on our end that is reinforcing this? And that wound up being really effective. And then they started to see, oh, I see. Another example was I think it was stockbrokers, or it was some system that was like seemed neutral, where it's like, oh, you're going to get paid or your promotions are going to be dependent on your performance. And it seemed like, okay, well, this feels like a clear criteria. It feels very neutral. But then the inequities in the organization got worse. And that's because what happened was women got assigned to the accounts that had less potential for growth. And when they were assigned to the accounts that had the same potential, they had the same performance. But because of these kinds of biases that can be so insidious and hard to recognize, they were continually assigned to accounts that just had lower volume, had less potential to begin with. So it really requires not only these pieces of transparency and systems and all that, but like this constant reevaluation and this reassessment and tweaking. And then I think from our end, as people who are on the other side experiencing these systems, like really, really important to start thinking about these things collectively and not just individually. So some of the best evidence we have on, what really helps close gaps in pay is really based on, or not just pay, but like literally anything. I'm using pay because we're talking about money. Is collective action, working as a group, and yeah, like in the most formalized form, that looks a lot like a union, which not only, speaking of surprising data, closes gaps in pay, but also reduced measures of racial resentment among union members, even after they were no longer union members. So I think it really speaks to like that it changes attitudes and not just outcomes, which is so important because so much of what we're talking about are cultural norms and social norms, and how those then entrench a lot of the other kinds of inequality we see. So I think that's really, really important to recognize. But I also think also, it doesn't have to be as formal as union. Like if you're working somewhere, where you don't see like a labor movement organizing, like that doesn't mean that you can't have your own way of facilitating community with other people and sharing resources and sharing information and working together against the status quo and these systems of power.
So I'm going to ask one more question before we go off recording so that we can have our conversation with insiders. But when you talk about this stuff, I want to ask, like, how does that work in supposedly progressive spaces? Because I
Mm.
know that a lot of the times we hear good words, but those don't actually turn into action. And I'm curious if you were able to get any data on like, does working for a progressive company that says that they care about this stuff, if they don't commit to the actual like data gathering and transparency, can you tell on the backside?
Yeah, there isn't what a company says doesn't matter. It's what they do that matters. And their outcomes matter. I think a lot of what we need to know about a culture, systems, who is working in good faith to try to do something about these things is very clear in terms of like who's represented in company management and leadership. And I don't just mean like one person who's not a white man, right? I mean real inclusion. I mean real um widespread like not just representation, but like a culture of like this is what we do to ensure that at every level we are valuing who is here. Like we know that the people who work here are bringing a lot of value to us, and the respect and care we have for these people, this is how we're gonna show that we value them, not with our language, but literally with this much of our pay audit procedures, or this of our parental leave, and it's available to everyone. It's available for those who are adopting. Like this is the kind of policy I want us to see more of, and I think we should be incredibly attuned to the companies and be making note of the companies that are rolling it back, because I think it's incredibly illuminating. It's really illuminating to see like what is like a sustained commitment to these things look like. And I'm not going to say like we're going to be able to all work in these places that value us properly. That's just not going to happen. And we're all compromised under the reality of our capitalism.
And
Um,
that's why we need to get to financial independence so that we can
E
leave if it sucks.
exactly, exactly. And but I think, like, I do think we should be we should be aware of these things, and then also start to think of them, like, not just as our individual problems. Like, yes, we have to create our own, like, economic autonomy in these systems that support ourselves, and so that we can kinda, like, opt out of these things that we don't want to partake in, especially. But I also think, like, it's such a tall order. It's such a tall order, and I don't want people to feel demoralized, and I think the way you push back against that is to build community. I think the way you do that is, like, to diversify, not just, like, a source of income or sources of investment. I think it's to diversify your sources of meaning, your sources of relationships, your sources of everything. Like when I talk about building community, I'm not just talking about it to like improve any person's bottom line. Like I'm talking about it to improve our well-being. I think these systems really thrive on our isolation. They thrive on us in blaming ourselves, and they thrive on us not sharing our stories of what's happening. And so like one of the most powerful things we can do is what you are doing here, which is having these conversations, letting people know they're not alone, like making these whisper networks we have not only wider but louder so they're not whispered, and people say, "Oh my gosh, like what is happening to me is not an exception. What is happening to me is the norm." And instead of like trying to like beat out that norm, what I want to do is change that norm. And what can I do with you to make that happen and with other people?
Well, that I feel like is a perfect transition to our conversation with just WPF Insiders. So before we hit the end to the recording, where can folks find you if they are watching this video later?
Sure. My most active platform is definitely Instagram. My handle is Stefanie O'Connell, Stephanie with an F. And I have a Substack newsletter that I occasionally update called Too Ambitious. But the book is called, again, The Ambition Penalty: How Corporate Culture Tells Women to Step Up and Then Pushes Them Down. But as you can tell from our conversation, it's a lot bigger than that, too. So I hope you check the book
Wonderful.
out. Thanks.